I'd like to call to order the City of Sonoma Planning Commission meeting of Thursday, September 13th, 2018. And with that, I'd have a call to order, please.
Commissioner Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner Willander.
Here.
Chair Felder.
Present.
Commissioner Bohar.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Here.
Commissioner Cribb.
Here. And may I have Commissioner Barnett lead the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A couple of things before we get started. There will be no new items heard by the Planning Commission after 10:30 unless the Commission by majority vote specifically decides to continue reviewing items. If they're not heard, we'll attempt to schedule a meeting as soon as possible after this session. Also, any decision reached by the Planning Commission tonight may be appealed to the City Council. Appeals must be filed with the City Clerk within 15 calendar days following the Planning Commission's decision. Last but not least, please, if you have cell phones, place them on silent mode so they don't disturb the meeting. And we are now at the agenda item of comments from the public on items not appearing on tonight's agenda. As you approach the podium, please state your name and address, and please keep your remarks to 3 minutes or less. So anyone cares to speak on items not on the agenda?
Good evening, commissioners and staff. My name is Lynn Marie DeVincent, 65 Guadalajara. Thank you so much for this opportunity to address you all. I have been doing community outreach for Sonoma neighbors who are concerned about the Verizon 5G applications before the city. So last month, progress was made when a tolling agreement was signed between the city and Verizon that puts the 7 close proximity microwave radiating cell units on a temporary withdrawn status. The remaining 3 in commercial zones will eventually come before you for review, as you know, and that review has been postponed several times. But there are now 2 new influences on this project that you absolutely must know about. The FCC has drafted a new 100-page order called Streamlining Deployment of Next Generation Wireless Infrastructure. It was released on September 5th and will be voted on September 26th. Comments can be made ex parte until Monday, September 17th. Very short window. If this passes, we are all in big trouble. I have a copy of an action alert that explains the bill that I'll provide for the public record. The other influence is a Senate Bill 3157 that is also an attempt to strangle any local authority, and it's under current review. And if these 2 documents, if they're approved, will destroy the good work the City of Sonoma has done to keep these toxic cell units out of residential areas, Verizon will just resubmit them. The City of Sonoma needs to act immediately, the way the City of Mill Valley just did with what's called an urgent ordinance. I'm sorry, it's 106 pages long. I just made the first copies of the first page for the public record. I've sent this to the city manager, and I hope that you will receive it from her. It is legal for the city to craft and approve an urgent ordinance like this, contrary to what I was told by someone that our city attorney believes nothing can be done while these applications are pending. That's not true. A new temporary urgent ordinance like Mill Valley's can be approved quickly by the council, which will further protect us in case this FCC regulation and the Senate bill are approved. I realize you do not take action on public comment items, but I just want you to be apprised of this very serious situation. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else care to address us?
My name is Mark Marthaler, live in Sonoma. I also am here to talk about the 5G cell tower project. And I had a display here that I wanted to show you representing, I went around and took pictures of all the houses that are in proximity of the 7 residential cell towers. It's quite a lot. So it's not just one house that would be affected by one cell tower. It's 4 directly would have direct impact, and then 3 or 4 maybe others. It's just to emphasize the fact that there's more than one house. We have one house that's actually for sale, and that house first listed at $900,000 is now down to $750,000. It's still reduced sign. I've mentioned this before in other public comments, but there is the understanding that under current code, the old code, that cell towers are not allowed, already not allowed in Sonoma residential districts. So to back up what Lynn Marie has just said, it's critical to get some kind of urgent ordinance like Mill Valley did. Mill Valley hasn't even had any applications in, but they see what's coming down the road with Senate Bill 3157, and the FCC regulations have already been drafted in expectation that this thing will get passed. The FCC regulations, as you read them today, are completely out of the world. You know, it has no reality to existing law and our rights. But 3157, when it comes into play, you know, I got a list of stuff. I'd love to just share this with you. It's new information for me, and I haven't had enough time to really soak it up. I'm trying to understand it myself, but I wouldn't be up here if, it's not important. I felt it was important. Everybody I talked to with regard to this issue doesn't like it. The health, the property values, everything is bad about it. I would really ask for some time to meet in a proper way and discuss more the details of this aspect of why we need an urgent ordinance to protect ourselves and update the code. If 3157 passes, okay, when it passes, we will have no standing because our code is like from 1996. It's like from the 19th century. It hasn't progressed with the rate of developments of the tech, right?
I'm sorry. Time's up.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd care to speak?
Good afternoon. Ken Brown, 1396 Lubeck Street in the town of Sonoma. I too am concerned about these issues, and I trust that the Planning Commission will pay attention and do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Hi, my name's John Duffy. I'm a local locksmith and a property owner in the commercial district. I have some commercial property on First Street that's right next to proposed existing close proximity cell tower. And I want to say that the existing health detriments to the 5th generation close proximity cell sites is being suppressed. And I know that the engineers aren't happy in anticipation of pushing this through. And I just, for me, it's like, there's billions of dollars at stake. It sounds like another Monsanto to me, and they're just going to roll this thing through. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned about myself because I'm right next to this cell tower. I'm concerned about the community, and I'm just expressing my concern. And like I'm saying, just like Big Tobacco and Monsanto, this is bad stuff. And the health aspects, the detrimental health aspects of this stuff is being suppressed on a major level. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else care to speak on public comment? Seeing none, I'll close this agenda item. I do have a question. Perhaps, John, the city attorney, do you know an urgent ordinance could only be enacted by the city council, is that correct?
That is true. An urgency ordinance is the same form as the moratorium ordinances that were described in the cannabis ordinance staff report. It's the same type of ordinance. It could only be adopted by the council. It's not even required to go before the planning commission for a recommendation under state law.
Thank you. So for the public, if someone would wish to see an urgent ordinance enacted, you have to appear at city council.
I had a question related to this as well. It has to do more with the mechanics, and is it appropriate to ask the city attorney a question?
You mean with regard to public comment?
Well, about the cell tower applications themselves.
Why don't you hold that till the end of the
Okay.
meeting to our commission comments?
Okay.
With that, we are at the point, do we have any changes or revisions to the agenda? If not, we'll move forward. Seeing none. Late correspondence.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there are two letters related to the first item on the agenda before you.
Thank you. With that, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Just a reminder, all items listed on the consent calendar are to be considered to be routine and will be acted upon by a single motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless members of the Planning Commission, staff, or public request specific items to be removed for separate action. We have 4 sets of draft minutes on the consent calendar. So does anyone care to pull any of those sets of minutes? Seeing none, I will ask for a motion to accept those items on the consent calendar.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes 6-0. And we'll move on to the public hearing. Item 7.1 is a public hearing to discuss, consider, and recommend draft ordinance amending the development code to establish local regulations for medicinal and adult use cannabis cultivation and commercial cannabis activities. And this action is exempt from environmental review under CEQA guidelines. So with that, I would turn to the staff for report and ask our Assistant City Attorney.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the Commission. Our recommendation tonight is for the Planning Commission to recommend the draft ordinance amending the Development Code to establish local regulations for medicinal and adult use cannabis cultivation and commercial cannabis activities. A word on the history. State law has evolved since the passage of Proposition 64 in November 2016 to allow cities to establish reasonable regulations on personal cultivation of cannabis indoors, to regulate or prohibit personal cultivation of cannabis outdoors, and to allow, regulate, or prohibit commercial cannabis activities. The City of Sonoma, in order to restrict cannabis activities, while cannabis regulations, permanent regulations, were being developed, adopted moratoria, the urgency ordinances, which were just referenced earlier, which would allow time for the permanent regulations to be developed. The first round of moratoria was adopted on November 7th, 2016. There were restrictions on indoor cultivation, and outdoor cultivation was prohibited for non-medicinal cannabis. The moratorium was extended December 12th, 2016, And then on November 6, 2017, it was extended a second time to November 6, 2018, which is obviously imminent and coming up. Now, there are no more extensions available for personal cultivation of non-medicinal cannabis. Those are all of the extensions that are allowable for moratoria under state law. At this point in time, permanent regulations need to be put in place. The second round of moratoria adopted on November 6, 2017 restricted indoor and prohibited outdoor cultivation of medicinal cannabis, and also prohibited commercial cannabis activities except for delivery for medicinal purposes from providers from outside the city. That moratorium was extended on December 4th, 2017 to expire on November 5th, 2018. And the council's desire is to have both the personal cultivation and the commercial cannabis activities included in a permanent ordinance. And that is the reason why we are here tonight. We have prepared a permanent ordinance for both personal cultivation and commercial cannabis activities. Importantly to the history of this item, on December 4th, 2017, at the same time that the moratorium on commercial cannabis activities was extended, the council directed that staff proceed with a community-based process to investigate and evaluate options for allowing cannabis dispensary, testing, and manufacturing facilities. Council also directed staff to draft an ordinance that would regulate indoor cultivation and prohibit outdoor cultivation. From the first direction for a community-based process, there were 2 workshops to study commercial cannabis activities in March and April of 2018. Staff also prepared a cultivation ordinance per council direction, which was considered by the Planning Commission on March 8th, 2018, which was recommended by the Planning Commission for adoption to the City Council. The cultivation ordinance, which regulated indoor cultivation, prohibited outdoor cultivation, had a first reading before the council, and the council introduced it on May 16, 2018. Or on April 16, 2018. However, on May 30th, 2018, the council considered the 2 cannabis items. First, considered the cultivation ordinance, and second, considered the commercial cannabis activities, the dispensary, testing, and manufacturing. Now, the council did not adopt the cultivation ordinance and gave direction to come back to it with an ordinance that would allow personal cultivation of a maximum of 3 plants outdoors, not the prohibition on outdoor cultivation, but would allow a maximum of 3 plants to be cultivated outdoors with reasonable restrictions. Council also did not garner a majority for any commercial cannabis activities to be permitted within the city, and so did not proceed with an ordinance that would allow commercial cannabis activities, and did not direct staff to draft an ordinance that would do so, and thereby gave direction to not allow commercial cannabis activities. So now we have this draft ordinance here tonight. And this draft ordinance is a combination of the former planning director's earlier ordinance, various provisions from the moratoria, and a model ordinance furnished by a consultant. The terms and conditions generally contain the standard terms and restrictions in other city and county ordinances, with modifications to tailor the ordinance to the city's municipal code and circumstances. This draft ordinance reflects the council's direction at its last meeting on this issue. The main terms of the ordinance are that all residents or structures in which indoor cultivation is occurring comply at all times with building, zoning, and permit requirements, have a ventilation and filtration system to prevent odors from exiting the structure, that no cultivation may occur on any property that does not have a residence, including a single-family home, apartment, condominium, or other similar dwelling, that no outdoor cultivation may occur on a parcel within 100 feet of a school, church, park, library, or other youth-oriented facility, that cultivation may only be conducted by a person as a full-time resident of the property and has written consent of the owner, that no gas products or generators be used to cultivate cannabis. It has an indoor lighting restriction. It has a provision that says cultivation within a fully enclosed and secure structure on the property can only be within the rear yard area and be a minimum of 10 feet from the nearest property line. That would be the setback, 10 feet. The yard area must be fully enclosed by a fence, at least 6 feet in height, which does not allow for viewing of plants from one side to the other side of the fence. There may be no visible evidence of cultivation on the parcel from the public right-of-way or be visible to adjoining properties or passersby. Accessory structures counted toward the 3-plant outdoor limit, as an example, greenhouses or hoop houses that do not require a building permit would also have to comply with all permit, zoning, building code, and other applicable requirements. And outdoor cultivation can only occur, again, within the rear yard, at least 10 feet from the nearest property line, and cannot exceed the area of 50 total square feet. There are a few cleanup matters in this ordinance. There is a typo. The 100-foot requirement that I just recited, where cultivation could not be within 100 feet of a school, church, or youth facility. There is a typo on page 7 in section B6, you may have noticed, which spells out 6, where 100 is written in parentheses. Obviously, that's supposed to be a 1. The repeal section of the ordinance, there was one more moratorium ordinance for outdoor cultivation of non-medicinal that will be added to that repeal section. The definition section of the ordinance, some of the definitions are more generally applicable, such as delivery, distribution, indoor, manufacture, outdoor, private residence, and solid fence. Those definitions will be made specific to cannabis. And also in the staff report, the exempt box for the CEQA environmental review is not X'd, and it should be as indicated in the draft ordinance. So our request tonight is for the Planning Commission to review and consider the draft ordinance and to recommend adoption of it to the City Council with those cleanup matters that I just described. And I would reiterate, it is the 11th hour for personal cultivation permanent regulations to be adopted in time to prevent the expiration of the personal cultivation moratoria without any permanent regulations being in place within the city. And that concludes my staff report. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bacci. Questions of staff?
Just for clarity purposes, so this evening, when we look at the definition of commercial cannabis activity, there has been a lot of discussion out and about dispensaries. That is not on the table tonight, is that correct?
This ordinance would prohibit dispensaries and all other commercial cannabis activities except for delivery from outside the city for medicinal cannabis only, yes.
Two questions. One, so if the moratorium expires and ultimately a policy is crafted and put into place a month or two after the moratorium expires, what happens? I mean, when you say we're at the 11th hour.
If the moratorium expires, then all of the regulations, the reasonable regulations like the use of carbon dioxide and gas and generators and the light conditions and all of those conditions that apply under the moratoria will simply disappear. They are not under state law. All the cities and counties have adopted those type of provisions in their ordinances in order to have a reasonable and responsible cultivation within their cities. But those provisions would all disappear.
And outdoor cultivation would be, would not be prohibited. Indoor cultivation is a right, essentially, under state law. Outdoor cultivation is not. Cities can choose outdoor cultivation or not, so outdoor cultivation would also be entirely without regulation for that period of
Until
time.
we pass something. So
Until-
what I'm saying is if we passed something and it was approved in January and it was expired since November, is there any, so that you have 2 months where there are no regulations, but you can always put in regulations at some point, correct?
You can always establish a new ordinance. The problem would be that you would have no regulations during that time. Structures that could be erected during that time would not, accessory structures or the fully enclosed and secure structures that are listed in the ordinance, they would have no regulation. They would not require any particular setback requirements. There wouldn't be any particular permitting requirements that are under this ordinance. So you would have structures that would be erected during that time, and then you would have an ordinance that would say regulate those structures, and you'd have a problem because you'd have a structure that's already existing and already there and has already been erected and constructed by the time that you have an ordinance that actually regulates it. So
Does that make it legal non-conforming?
that's correct.
And then my second question is, I'm just sort of curious why this ordinance is even before the Planning Commission, because this is sort of in a city council policy matter, and they've sat and heard, long presentations from consultants, and I assume that's informed some of their decision-making and ultimate policy direction. And, I don't think we've really been involved in the process. We've never had a presentation. We've never really, you're asking us to approve stuff that we haven't really had much, I would say, participation in. And so is this just sort of a pro forma situation? It has to go through the Planning Commission? Because typically, from what I understand, when policy matters, it starts with the Planning Commission, and we really dig down into it, and then we offer recommendations, and then it goes to the City Council. And it seems like in this situation, it's been reversed. So my question is, why is it even before us at this point if the City Council knows exactly what they want to do?
Well, it has been a long and winding road, in a sense. And the reason why it has to go back to the Planning Commission tonight is the last time the Planning Commission considered the cannabis cultivation ordinance, it was for prohibition of outdoor cultivation and had various different terms as a result. Under state law, when the council decided not to go forward, not to give that a second reading, that ordinance, then a new zoning ordinance would first have to be considered by the Planning Commission. And since the Planning Commission did not consider the ordinance that we got direction from the City Council the last time it was before the Planning Commission, it has to go back to the Planning Commission for the Planning Commission to consider and review and make a recommendation. So that is why it is back. This ordinance is before the Planning Commission tonight.
And if I may, through the chair, I believe Commissioner Barnett is incorrect. We did actually, the ordinance that was being read by the council when they decided to change it was the ordinance that we discussed and passed. And maybe it was prior to your sitting
That
on
ordinance, the council sent us an ordinance last time as well, and we just basically signed off on it. Everything is originated at the council level, and so,
But
in my view,
but legally, we have to be the body that passes the. And so, I mean,
that's just what I'm asking. Is this like a legal requirement?
Yeah, we've
really
considered it before.
One at a time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, I mean, that it's not correct that we haven't discussed this issue in this forum before, because it was the ordinance that we passed to the city council that had the prohibition on open growing outdoor, the outdoor growing, and that's why it's back to us now. It seems like.
Yeah, I said we've never had a presentation from consultants. We weren't really involved in the creation of the ordinance. We passed an ordinance the city council sent to us last time, which is sort of happening again. That's what I said, so.
Well, just the hypothetical, if we were to choose not to recommend this ordinance to the city council, what happens then?
It would still go to the council for consideration. The council would receive the information that the Planning Commission did not recommend the ordinance. It would be reported to the council.
But they have full authority to enact it in any case.
The council would have authority to consider and to enact it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, to Commissioner Wellender's point earlier, obviously a dispensary is not part of this ordinance, but if we could make the recommendation that it should be, correct?
Yes, the Planning Commission
We're supposed to
could
evaluate this ordinance, talk about it, go through all the issues.
Yes, the Planning Commission could make a recommendation that there be a change to the ordinance and that there be a different provision. And again, that information would be reported to the City Council.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Just one, it's a detail. The distance of 100 feet that has been written into this draft from schools, churches, libraries, places, what's the history behind coming up with that's basically could be 250 wide foot parcels, residential parcels. So I'm curious as far as what drove that. Was it another ordinance from another community? Was it something that just came out of the air, or?
There is a model ordinance that the city received from a consulting firm on this, and that provision, it was actually quite a bit larger, but it was looked at and it was decided on staff level that 100 feet would be a reasonable distance.
Okay, thank you.
One more.
To follow up on that, is it the parcel that's within 100 feet, or is it the area that's cultivating the cannabis?
It's technically in the code the area of the cultivation, and it's for outdoor cultivation, not indoor.
All right, thank you.
If there's no more questions, I'll take it out to the public for public comment. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes or less. Anyone care to speak?
Ken Brown, excuse me, 1396 Lubeck Street. I attended the 2 workshops the city provided for the citizens. They were overwhelmingly in favor of outdoor cultivation and a medicinal cannabis business in the city of Sonoma. I mean, it's just kind of renders me speechless, which is not something that I'm normally occurs with me. So many towns, so many cities have taken a look at medicinal cannabis and outdoor cultivation and have agreed to it. It's unfathomable for me to understand why the city of Sonoma isn't among them. So I implore you to think about this. My wife is a cancer patient. Cannabis shifted the entire dynamic of her medical treatment and her recovery. There's great success with fighting the opioid problem in America using cannabis. Epilepsy. These are proven benefits to the community. You know, as a side note, people have been smoking cannabis in Sonoma for a very long time. And that's not going to change. I think the city's rules need to change.
Thank you, Ken. Anyone else? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public comment. I have a question of staff. According to state law, if a dispensary is permitted, does it have to include recreational use, or can it be limited to medicinal?
It could be limited to medicinal. And if I could take the opportunity, I want to correct the answer I gave a moment ago, if that's possible. I was just looking at the ordinance because I was a little concerned about how that was going to be calculated. And the question was whether it was the parcel line, the nearest parcel line, from the property where the cannabis was being cultivated outdoor, whether that was the measurement or the area of cultivation to the nearest school or church or youth facility. And I was incorrect in what I said. It was not the area of where the cannabis is cultivated. It is the nearest parcel line for the parcel on which the cannabis is being cultivated outdoor, 100 feet from that nearest parcel line to the church, school, or other youth facility. I apologize for having that mistake.
Okay, so if I heard your answer correctly, then we would have the ability to recommend, if we so chose, to allow medicinal dispensaries within city limits with some conditions, if we could make that our recommendation if we chose to do that.
The Planning Commission could make that recommendation. Remember that because of the period in time that we're dealing with, and that it has to come before the council very soon, that the Planning Commission will need to consider those regulations that are going to be in the final ordinance. So you would probably want some restrictions and regulations on the dispensary and the location where those dispensaries could be, and so that level of detail is not in this ordinance. So I
understand, and I realize it would present a difficult situation, but I'm just looking for what we have the purview to do.
The commercial cannabis aspect, which would involve a medical dispensary, is in the second moratorium, right? Which we have another year on.
Under state law, that second moratorium could be extended for one more year.
So we're only under the gun for the outdoor, correct?
For the under the gun being that this is the last moratorium that can be adopted. There are no more moratoria that can be adopted. That is correct. I do believe is council's direction that both, however, be included in the permanent ordinance.
Okay, we're open for discussion and possible action by the commission.
I had more of a question. It has to do with the initiative, or the ballot initiative that I guess would be moving forward in 2020. And could you enlighten us as to what that would be comprised of, and what effect it would have on any action that we or the council takes?
So to answer that question would require a legal analysis, which our office has not done because the city is not confronting that question at this point, because that would be on the ballot in 2020, and this is an ordinance, if it is adopted, that would be taking effect in 2018. So that's an analysis that it would require legal analysis to compare the provisions, and that's I'm sorry, but I can't give you an answer to that tonight.
Would it be fair to say that, for example, if we were to pass this ordinance as proposed, and in 2020 the voter a voter initiative would allow, for example, the commercial sale of cannabis, then we would then everything that we would have passed would basically be null and void after a voter initiative. So is it fair to say that, theoretically, a year and a half from now, we may be looking at performance and new zoning standards to accommodate the will of the people that live in Sonoma?
It really would require more of a question of the provisions of both sides, and to review and determine how they are into the same code. So I really can't give you an answer as to what the effect would be if that were to pass. I believe there was a report that was done on effects. However, if this ordinance is adopted, the ordinance can be amended at any time between 2018 and 2020. It just requires a regular process of amendment. So what the ordinance could look like tonight could be different in 2019 or in 2020 with amendments.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is it true that there has been really no legal analysis of that initiative, so that even if the initiative passed, that it would have to go through some kind of a legal review to see if it's actually enforceable?
I believe that is something that has been stated. Now, I have to say I have not been involved in looking at the initiative or the effects of the initiative, but I do believe that information has been reported to the council and the city as evidenced by the comments of the chair.
Thank you.
As a follow-up to the comment about the ordinance can be amended at any time, would that be initiated by the Plan Commission? Would that be a response to a direction from City Council, or what would be the process of an amendment?
Sure. So again, the reason why this ordinance has to come before the Planning Commission tonight, it's a zoning ordinance. And any amendment to a zoning ordinance under state law must first go to the Planning Commission for its review and its consideration, and then for an opportunity for a recommendation to be made by the Planning Commission. So it would first go to the Planning Commission, and then it could proceed to the City Council.
Is there any, may I ask a question? Is there any reason, again, and I brought this up earlier, why we sort of get this at the end? And was this just a unique circumstance? I mean, when you say it's a zoning ordinance and it has to go to the Planning Commission, typically that would, in a perfect world, involve the Planning Commission sort of listening to consultants, talking about all the issues, weighing the pros and cons, and helping to craft the ordinance. And so for the second time here, we have, we can talk about adding a medicinal dispensary, or we can make any recommendation we want, but it seems like the City Council, knows what it wants to do currently. And so, I guess I'm just stating that, it's sort of hard for me to approve or make recommendations on an ordinance that we really haven't been given much information about, beyond I mean, the staff report, but when I'm talking, like the city council, in my view, crafted an ordinance after, consultants were involved and, a lot of public input, et cetera. And I feel like this is just a sort of a pro forma exercise. I guess that's more of a statement.
Well, I'd just like to support that concept. Given what I understand about this now and over the past couple of months has really been not part of our deliberations, and I don't have much to hold on to in terms of grounding in my approval or disapproval of this. And it seems like this issue of the dispensary is a very big public topic. It also sounds like the city council is not in the mood to do that, and they could ignore our recommendation. Secondarily, you've pointed out that there's little time to really craft a document that would be viable and work by the deadline. So it seems like it neutralizes anything that we might do, which is, maybe that's just a point I want to make, but it doesn't seem like we have much to work with here.
Anyone else want to join in? I mean,
Yeah.
at some point in this discussion, we should move towards an approach that we would like to take on the ordinance.
Well, I mean, my approach, just to throw my few cents in here. One, quite directly in the past, what has been a year or so now, at least 5 of us directly serve at the pleasure of the city council. And so also, while we did not hold specific hearings in this room to talk about it, they were all public hearings. Certainly I know that I followed and paid attention to and understood, as well as, so I feel like just as before, when we were presented with a sort of pro forma ordinance to evaluate, and as I recall, at that time, we had a significant amount of vigorous discussion in this room with the public and this group in crafting what we thought was an adequate personal grow ordinance at that time. And it was only in its reading back in council that then the council decided to amend it, since we had voted in favor of not allowing any outdoor cultivation for personal use. I believe we have an obligation to the community and under state law to at least for certain get on our books some ordinance relative to personal cultivation, so that people understand what the ground rules are and that it's clear and apparent that this community supports that. I think the issue of the dispensary and other commercial use is obviously a little more controversial at this point, and certainly if we pass this ordinance, if we say we're in favor of it as it is, which I am, then that topic can be dealt with later rather than having some period of limbo where there's no specific ordinance on the books, or basically kicking it back to council to say, well, you guys got to do another moratorium. I would say let's get this on the books so that we have something reasonable that has to do with personal grow, so that those things are clear and present to our community, and that if there are members of this commission that feel they want to have a more active voice in crafting that next piece, then that we also voice that as well, that we say that the hearings and the discussion about dispensary and commercial use should originate in this body rather than from the council. That would just be my personal opinion.
I was just going to say, in terms of what was in our packet and the content of the ordinance. I certainly am not in a position where I feel prepared to have any forward-moving discussion about a dispensary. And I think that it'd be appropriate to continue that, and if it can be agendized sooner than later, I'm open to that, but I am leaning to supporting the ordinance as it's been presented in terms of personal use, but I need considerable more time about the concept of dispensary.
Anyone else? Well, it seems to me that we have kind of a divide here, but I would think that I'm hearing a consensus on at least moving forward with the personal cultivation aspects of this ordinance, and that we perhaps have an option to propose on dispensaries that either we accept the ordinance as it is, or we could make a recommendation that the council either add a provision such as medical or dispensaries, medicinal dispensaries, or continue a moratorium until they can decide it. So we have about 3 ways we could go.
I guess I'm going to chime in a little bit about the commercial aspect. A lot of the idea of having a land use and establishing a land use and creating zoning performance standards does require a lot of deliberation and thought, and what zoning districts should they be located in, what sort of parking requirements would be required, what sort of setbacks from community facilities like schools, churches, and parks. Should that be 100 feet? Should that be 1,000 feet? Should there even be distance requirements? All these things come into play if you're really, if the council really wanted to consider this, or if the planning commission was to consider this. So these would be things that we'd have to spend a great deal of time talking about, and I don't think we're in the position to do that. And the reason why I brought up the voter initiative in 2020, really I believe ultimately what's going to happen is the will of the people is going to decide whether or not they want commercial dispensaries in the city of Sonoma. And I believe it'll be at that point where the planning commission will have the most effective, how should I put it, the most effective way of communicating to the council how that should go down if it does. So my feeling is we're not really prepared to look at zoning requirements or even make recommendations. I think my personal opinion is that the city should look at requirements for dispensaries, but we're not anywhere near there. And I believe that that the commission should respect the council's direction and ultimately find in a year and a half whether or not the council is aligned with what the people in the city of Sonoma really believe and feel. So my recommendation would be to make the recommendation that the resolutions before us and move forward with that.
So, I mean, whatever we do, the council is going to pass this ordinance. So I think we should use the opportunity to at least make recommendations, because I agree, we're certainly not at a point where we can make recommendations on dispensaries based on all the detailed issues that we have not been given, or information we have not been given. But I do think unless we make that recommendation now, and I'm not saying to support a dispensary, but just to have further discussion and deliberation over it, it'll never happen. I mean, we are all aware of the process, the city process, and how long everything takes, and it'll just, in my view, be forgotten unless we make some sort of statement about it. Additionally, I think this voter initiative can came about because of some inaction or some perceived inaction on the city's part. And if you're familiar with the voter initiative, which I am, the types of commercial cannabis operations that would be allowed if it's passed wouldn't even have a use permit. I mean, the Planning Commission wouldn't even be part of the process. And in my view, that's why that initiative, while I think the general sort of spirit and intent behind it was understandable, that initiative, in my view, is quite dangerous for the city, because if it's passed, a dispensary would not require a use permit. And so there's been I think, as the city attorney said, this has been a long, interesting, winding road and process. And so, and I certainly don't think it's over. And so I would support, well, whatever we do, it's, in my view, not going to matter, because the city council is going to pass this initiative. And so I think we should take the opportunity to, we can pass it, but also offer thoughts and advice on where we should go from here. I also have some questions and concerns about the initiative as drafted. For example, I think 50 square feet for outdoor cultivation for 3 plants is rather large. I don't know, and again, this is just an example of we don't have the information. There aren't cannabis consultants here, but how large does a cannabis plant get? You know, I mean, are these going to be commercial style cannabis plants outside, or are these just going to be small personal style plants? Because 50 square feet seems very large. Also, no outdoor cultivation in multifamily. You know, obviously we have an apartment project next. We are trying to support in a city like Sonoma, basically the only future development really can be multifamily. So are we saying you can't have a little cannabis plant out on your balcony in a little pot that's like that big? Or again, I don't know how big plants get, but that seems restrictive to me. If we have a certain population in town that lives in multifamily units, and I assume that will grow as we add more multifamily units, those people can't cultivate outside. You know, and the 100-foot restriction, you know, if you follow the rest of the ordinance, that it can't be in a public view and it has to be in the backyard, et cetera, and most of that cultivation will be probably beyond 100 feet from the school, even if the parcel is within, I think that's restrictive. I mean, all those homes on Church Street behind St. Francis or on MacArthur and by Prestwood, I mean, it just seems like we're unfairly limiting who can cultivate outdoors. You know, and why 3 plants? Why not 2? Why not 6? I mean, these are all questions that I have, and I'm fully aware that they probably don't matter at this point, but I wouldn't be opposed to offering some, you know, at least public recommendations to the city council in terms of, like, for example, I think a medical, not a recreational, but just a medical dispensary is a worthy topic of discussion at the planning commission level in terms of, you know, but again, we don't have all the information, and that's not something I can necessarily recommend right now, but I think that it wouldn't be the worst idea in the world if the planning commission made some recommendations and suggestions to the city council in addition to whatever else we decide.
Just for Commissioner Barnett's edification, the six plants is the state law. So I think what the city did was basically say 3 in, 3 out. That's where the number came from, because the state law limits it to 6 plants total. So
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, but why can't you put all 6 outside?
Well, I think
just 2. And I mean,
you know, we had this discussion. I think that's the kind of where we were before, in that we just felt like it all should be inside. in at least in our prior discussions, because that was our recommendation to council. So now so I think 50-50 seems reasonable to me, but I mean, I don't know if you have another.
Well, I mean, if you look at the ordinance, all the type of lighting and regulations you need to grow inside, it seems like it would just be much easier to grow outside, personally. I mean, just that, to me, that seems more reasonable.
I would certainly be in favor of us recommending adoption of this ordinance to the city council, but with some conditions of having us address some of the other aspects that we've talked about tonight, like the medical dispensary or other changes to the ordinance, to agendize that as a planning commission item, to present those things to the city council for a future change to the ordinance. Is that a way out? I mean, can we move forward with something like that? Does anybody want to try a motion?
Well, I would move, I'll try that, because I think that's, I mean, I would move that we approve the resolution as presented with the correction to the typographical errors noted by city attorney, and that we attach to that a recommendation that the Planning Commission agendize the topic of commercial cannabis and dispensaries as an active discussion item in anticipation of allowing that type of use in the community.
Well, we should have a second first. Is there anybody to second that?
I'd second that.
Okay, discussion?
I'm curious, I think Commissioner Barnett made some interesting comments about how exclusionary it is right now for those living in multifamilies. If we recommend that this ordinance be passed on to the city council, it is conceivable we could make the recommendation that further discussion or further consideration should be given to whether or not there should be the ability to have personal, to grow cannabis in a multifamily setting. Okay, I'll rephrase it. If we support this ordinance tonight and it gets forwarded on to City Council, Commissioner Barnett brought some interesting comments up about what is currently rather exclusionary in terms of location of 100 feet, plus the idea of, for those residents that live in multifamily. Would it be fair to say that we could have later discussion about these topics that could be then recommended as an amendment to this ordinance?
Would you consider a friendly amendment to your motion to include not only medical dispensaries, but other personal grow aspects of the ordinance?
Related to multifamily, certainly.
Would the second also accept that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Just a question about effective process and so forth. Given the fact that I understand that this ordinance could be amended by the city council at any time in the future after it's enacted, is that accurate?
Yes, any ordinance could potentially be amended at any point down the line.
With that in mind, does it make any sense to make these recommendations directly to the city council rather than be starting it out here in our commission meetings and have them bullet point recommendations that the city council consider these at its soonest, or some such a thing as that?
Well, isn't it true that if they would choose to amend that ordinance, that it would have to come through this commission first?
That is correct.
I mean, I'm just a little concerned that if we agenda, I appreciate Chair Commissioner Cribb's motion. I wonder whether we would get more action if we were to make them directly to the city council and with some urgent language in there. They could do that any time. They could begin that and they could finish that seemingly much more quickly than we could. Does that make any sense?
Well, I mean, can we amend this ordinance?
No, we're running up against the wall.
The commission can just make a recommendation tonight.
So we're not even passing the ordinance, we're just making recommendations?
Correct. Making a recommendation for
Right,
the
so
city
we can
council
make
to
whatever
adopt or not to adopt, or whatever recommendation. the
So we
commission
could
would
make a
like to
recommendation to adopt with these changes?
The commission could do that.
We don't expect our recommendations to be incorporated in given this short time, I'm guessing. Is that accurate?
Could you turn your microphone on, please?
I'm sorry. We don't really expect that our recommendations could be incorporated in any effective operational way by the time this thing has to be done. Is that correct? The ones we've heard, let's talk about, banter about.
I believe the motion on the floor doesn't tie it to this current ordinance being adopted. It talks about a future discussion that's agendized here with recommendations on what we would hope the ordinance could be changed to.
Okay, I guess I understood that. So I'm asking whether we should direct it to the council and not to our deliberations in terms of getting that done quicker. Any comment on that?
I believe that's what this motion is doing, is it's directing it to the council. Am I
That's
mistaken?
my intention, yeah. I mean, I think it's been pointed out. I mean, this is in essence, came to us as the will of the council, and I'm just saying we'll let them impose their will at this time, and that we feel like at least my motion is the intention that was on the issue of commercial uses, that discussion originate with this body, that we begin seriously debating the issues that, for example, Commissioner McDonald, Commissioner Barnett have brought up about issues related to commercialization. And then I accepted the amendment that we also consider more closely the issue of multifamily, since there is so much multifamily in this community and likely will be more. So I'm just, as a matter of practicality, trying to say, let's move this forward. Let's support the resolution in the sense that we're just going to say, yes, we're not going to change it, but that we want to be actively involved in the next phase.
If there's no further discussion, I'm going to call the question. So we have a motion on the floor for recommending adoption of this ordinance with further recommendations to have the Planning Commission consider some other changes to the ordinance to be discussed here and recommended to the council at a future time.
Can we add a time limit to that discussion, like within the next 3 months?
I'd be perfectly happy to. Would you entertain that as a friendly amendment as well?
I would. I'll listen to.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
Staff,
Could I suggest that we not put a time limit on it tonight, given the current state of the staff in the city and given the priorities and projects we're working on right now? I think it's reasonable to say that maybe within the next year that could be considered, but to say 3 months might be a bit much for the staffing right now.
Do you feel strongly about that, Commissioner Barnett?
No, I just know how this is all going to play out. So I feel like this is going to be the last time we talk about cannabis in probably a while. And so we should use this opportunity to communicate thoughts to the city council. And that's my point.
Okay. I'm going to call the question. Would you do a roll call, please?
No.
Yes.
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 Yes. Sure, go ahead.
Just a follow-up question. In terms of the voter initiative in 2020, if we, between now and then, take some action in terms of recommending things like medicinal dispensary or other commercial cultivation, and we set parameters on, zoning, whatever, and then the initiative comes, would the initiative then usurp all of the regulations that we enacted prior to the vote?
I apologize, but it really would require a legal analysis of what the code says at that time and what the initiative says. I have not done that analysis. I really can't provide you an answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move along to the next item. Okay, and Commissioner Wellander needs to recuse himself on this item due to business interest, is that correct? So the next item is an application for a use permit and parking exception to develop a 0.68 acre site with 12 residential apartments, 2 live-work units located at 19410 Sonoma Highway. With that, I'll have a staff report. And before we get into the staff report, we don't have a very large audience here, but we're going to proceed with a description of the project and then a discussion of the initial study, the environmental review, at which time we will take public comment, and then we'll move on to a staff report for the use permit itself. Wendy.
Thank you, Chair Felder and members of the Commission. Just give me one moment to get my high-tech computer running so I can show very beautiful pictures of the project. Turn on the dock cam, Christina. As Chair Felder mentioned, we're going to break up the public hearing this evening into 2 parts. First, I'm going to give an overview of the mitigated negative declaration. We'll open it up to the public, get public comment. I'll address your questions, and then I'll give a presentation on the use permit and the parking exception. We'll address your questions, open that up to the public hearing, and go from there. So an initial study was prepared for the project last year. The proposal, though, involves redeveloping the site with a mixed-use project consisting of 12 apartments and 2 live-work units. As I mentioned, an initial study was prepared last year to evaluate potential environmental impacts. All potentially significant impacts would be reduced to a less than significant level through the incorporation of mitigated measures which have been incorporated into the conditions of approval. 3 topics were identified as requiring special studies, and these were traffic, noise, and cultural and archaeological resources. The traffic analysis recommended that left-hand turn lanes be prohibited from exiting the site. Because the project is along Sonoma Highway, a noise study was prepared to ensure that noise impacts from the highway were not impacting the occupants of the apartments. And finally, a cultural resource study and archaeological study was prepared. Last year, the Caltrans submitted comments suggesting that there might be architectural or archaeological resources on the property. This triggered the requirement for what they call an extended phase 1 study. It's a report and then actual holes were dug on the property to find out if any resources were there. The report concluded that there were no archaeological resources on the site, and Caltrans has no further issues with the proposal. The initial study was circulated last year for 30 days, and only one response letter was received, and that was from Caltrans, and the response to that comment letter was attached in the initial study, attachment 11. And that concludes the staff report portion of the mitigated negative declaration. At this time, we'd like to open it up to the public for comment.
Okay, so we'll open up public hearing. If anyone cares to discuss the environmental review with the initial study, this is your time to come forward. Seeing none, we will then move on to the staff report for the use permit.
Some of you may recall that a study session was conducted for this project back in February of 2017. The applicant received comments from this commission and revised the project accordingly. The project consists of 12 apartment units and 2 live-work units. The live-work units are intended for residential and retail, and they would be located towards the front of the parcel. Here's the site plan. So the live-work units would be in building C. And Christina, can you turn on the dock cam? Oh, look, there it is. 3 floor plans are proposed with living areas between 850 square feet and 1,056 square feet. The proposal is consistent with the general plan and the development code, with the exception of the number of compact parking spaces proposed. Of the 30 spaces proposed, 11 would be compact spaces, which exceeds the allowable parking percentage of 30% by 7%. So instead of 30% of compact spaces, they're proposing 37% to be compact spaces. And this requires the Planning Commission to approve a parking exception. With regard to the discussion of project issues, the Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission reviewed this project in July of 2017. They had some concerns about traffic impacts related to prohibiting left-hand turn lanes from the project. So the applicant is proposing to install what we call a K-rail in the pavement to prohibit vehicles from driving and making a left-hand turn. And this commission also wanted to ensure that there was adequate space in the highway to install proposed Class 2 bicycle lanes. The project meets or exceeds all applicable zoning requirements and has been carefully designed to fit in with the surroundings. So staff recommends approval of the mitigated negative declaration and the use permit and the parking exception. Thank you.
Questions of staff?
I had a couple questions. One, could you verify with me that the site exceeds the parking requirements, and if so, by how many spaces?
So 28 parking spaces are required, and the applicant is proposing 30.
30. Okay, thanks.
I have a follow-up question on that. Wendy? Since there are more parking spaces provided than are required, has it been considered to remove the 3 uncovered compact spaces and make those 2 regular spaces, in which case they would still satisfy the parking requirement and they would not need a parking exception?
Well, that's a great question. I think that we should pose to the applicant.
Okay.
Wendy, regarding the live workspaces, the first commission meeting that I wasn't involved in yet granted the live work in lieu of retail space, right? Considering this is a commercial development, is that accurate? And do they require business licenses to occupy those spaces?
The original proposal that was considered by the Planning Commission during the study session, the applicant proposed commercial space in this building in the front, but they revised it to be live work. So there are no current conditions of approval that would require folks to have a business license. And I would recommend that that not be a condition of approval and allow the units to be either live work or just live.
Could I ask your rationale for that recommendation on not asking for business licenses?
Sure. So I'm referring to the Carneros Village Loft project that was live work, developed as live work units. And there was a requirement for a business license. And that theme didn't necessarily work out. So it was a requirement that if you live in one of the units, that you have a business license for a business. And not everyone who lived there was using the downstairs unit for business.
Maybe I can shed some light on this. Regardless of whether or not you're in a live-work situation, if you're conducting a business out of your home, if you're like me, a landscape designer, or you're a massage therapist or whatever, you're required to, under the city code, to have a business license regardless. So I would imagine that it's kind of already covered. You're not supposed to do something without a business license. So I think that's...
Yes, that's correct. If you had if you were occupying the live work unit and had a business, you would have to have a business license.
Yes. But just not require somebody to have one for occupying a domicile in that space, yes.
It seems to me that those are two different issues. The fact that the First Street, I appreciate your comments about the First Street project, and I understand that evolved into something based on the organic nature and the context and the market and a bunch of other things. But nevertheless, the general plan calls for commercial, commercial service retail elements when we give an exception for that. And the words in the general plan are, when you give a break like that, it should have a local economy element in mixed use that includes local community service uses. And it seems like we're making a sham out of that element of the commercial zoning. That's what I'm having a problem with here. And the fact that we have a live-work, our live-work ordinance, I suspect, is not fully fledged. I am very familiar with the live-work and work-live elements in the East Bay, Berkeley, Emeryville, Oakland, San Leandro. They are very thriving businesses in those work, live, and live work. They distinguish in those communities between live work has different parameters of how much living and how much working, and work live is primarily work. And that encourages commercial businesses to be in there and to encourage business. And it seems to me that we should be beefing up our ordinance so that we get action out of that, rather than just let let a good commercial use, which generates commerce, morph into residential. It seems like a sham to just recognize that it's not being utilized. So that is a difficulty for me. Thank you, but I understand the situation.
One thing, just to piggyback on what you're saying, and also the whole idea of having a business license, is the fact that if it is a live-work unit, you theoretically could operate a coffee shop out of the ground floor and live upstairs. So then it begs the question, you would definitely need a business license. You'd need probably licenses from the county health department, and I don't even know if we would even have adequate parking on site to accommodate that, because that could theoretically trigger more parking. So that's something that our commission is going to have to discuss as we approve this use permit.
Can I also follow up? So what exactly, and I've heard this term for many years now, and I still don't really understand what live work is. So am I incorrect in saying that it is a commercial space that you're allowed to live in?
That seems reasonable to me. I can read the definition to you if you'd like.
Well, I don't know if that's necessary. I'm just wondering, because the way you were earlier describing it, why isn't this just a 14-unit apartment building? Why the distinction for to live work if we're not going to maintain that they be live work?
I think the intention of the applicant is to have those units as live-work units. He originally was proposing 100% commercial in the front building.
Right.
But this commission said, no, I think you should do live-work instead.
So is that front building, since this is a commercial zone, is that a commercial building? Is that a commercial space that you're allowed to live in? I don't know. I'm just
A typical live-work type situation might be, for example, Commissioner McDonald was a massage therapist, so they might have a studio space, and I'm sure, and as these are designed, there's like sort of an open large space that would be where your commercial activity would occur, and then adjacent to that or above it or whatever would be your living quarters. I mean, I grew up in my dad's hardware store. You know, the front was a hardware store, and in the back it was where we lived. You know, and then like the Bowden Plumbing store next to my had the old idea that there was the you lived above and you had the business down below. I mean, that's what live work is. It's a single space that combines some commercial space with some living space.
Right.
But you don't, I mean, or the house that I lived in the city had been a doctor, and his office was on one floor, and the living space was on another floor. So that's kind of the idea of live work.
But live work is a new term, right? I mean, I know what you're talking about is, I think, different, like in the city and Bowden Plumbing. I mean, live work is like a recent concept in the last 25 years. Things are.
It's just a renaming of what's been a model that's existed for years, where people ran a business and lived in the same physical structure, and like the old Boys and Girls Club is live work lofts. You know, some people have offices there and conduct business, and also
let me
live in
remind
space.
you that we're in the period of questions for staff.
Okay.
And
All right.
we
Sorry
want to
about
get
that.
into
Well, I mean,
discussion.
it's just a question because I know that there were a few live work units at that Carneros place, and I think also at the Dieter property, the Sonoma Court Shops, and I've never really, from what I understand, a lot of, there isn't a requirement that there be a business there. And so I'm just curious how that process is regulated and how that all works. And, is it a commercial space? Is it a residential space? Yeah.
So I think the applicant can probably provide some insight on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do have a couple more questions of staff. So under this use permit, under the conditions of approval, right now there's no language that would prohibit or restrict or in any way, shape, or form the sale of foods or beverages or or any sort of retail, or any parameters on the sale of retail goods?
That's correct. And if there was a proposal to do that, it would require a use permit.
Oh, so, but what's before us is a use permit, right?
Yes,
Okay, so, but right now, there are no conditions of approval as being proposed by staff that would limit, regulate, or restrict retail sales or the sales of foods or beverages.
not in these conditions of approval. However, if someone wanted to do that there, they would need a use permit. You need a use permit for a restaurant.
Okay, but theoretically, we could, as a commission, prohibit something of that nature that would run with the land.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions?
Wendy, regarding the traffic study, do you recall roughly when the last meeting was scheduled, but it was a series of continuances because of the Caltrans situation? It was around February, March, something like that.
It was a year ago.
Right. Is that about the time frame?
Yes, this commission was scheduled to hear this item in August of last year. We received a letter from Caltrans, and it's been continued since.
Was it August? Okay. Anyway, in that time frame, I had a meeting with staff, and I registered a concern about the ingress and egress being risky because of the curve and the inability for the oncoming and exiting cars to see each other and so forth, in a nutshell. And at the last meeting that Jim Moore ran, I registered a concern about that same issue, and I asked for the parking study, the traffic study to be included. I guess that's why that report was in there. But did staff find any issues regarding that on the traffic issue of egress and ingress?
The traffic engineer is here tonight, and I believe he can address those questions for you.
Okay, but staff felt it was appropriate to approve that and recommend that. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have. Thanks.
Okay, with that, I think that's all the questions. So we'll take it out to the public. Would the applicant like to make a presentation? State your name and address.
My name is Ken Taub. I represent the, good evening, commissioners, staff. We've started this project quite some time ago, but I know a couple of you were here when we originally presented the project. So I made a list of a few items that I'd like to go over, and then we can jump into the item that seems to be the biggest concern. That's the commercial residential live workspace. And I'll kind of give you my impression and what I've studied from the code and what our intent is. First of all, these are some of the comments that from the initial review. They wanted to move the ADA spaces closer to the middle. We've done that. There was a visual concern about the parking from Highway 12. So what we did was put a 4-foot wall that extends all the way across, and I think it's now 3'6". You can see it right here. There was one of the comments where there was a need for more light in the back of the A units. So what we did, we turned the N units into the courtyards, and then we provided skylights in the center unit to bring in more light. The traffic concerns we can talk about. I've got the engineer here. One thing that we did do is when we met with the citizens group, they wanted a bigger radius, and we provided that. We sent that information over to the traffic engineer, and he can reply to that. The relationship to the neighborhood. One thing that was important, we did meet with the neighbor to the, I guess that would be to the east, which is the motel. And they've been in the loop ever since we started the project. And they were, the only concern they had is that we don't look down into the pool area. And as you notice on our site plan, the second building, which is the A units, it's been pulled to the north so that the units don't look into the pool area. So, and they were happy about that. So the biggest item has to do with one, the live workspace, and two, the redesign. For lack of a better term, we've sort of gone to more of a modern farm look. We've got board and batten up above, stucco, and we're sort of in the grays now. There was a lot of discussion about live work, or about the front. And a number of the commissioners, and I'm not sure the commissioner's here tonight, but his biggest concern is that it doesn't turn. We had two concerns. One was the traffic, and two, the identification of the retail. And so we've given that a lot of thought, but they pointed to the project that's one block away that's still vacant, that was designated for commercial, and as you can see, it's still there, still trying to determine what it's going to be. I know that Mr. McDonald has suggested we go all residential. He even asked the planning commission, the planners, if that was possible with regards to the code, and their answer was yes. So one of the commissioners had identified the fact that, well, why don't you do a live workspace? So we went back and, among ourselves, we talked about this quite a bit. So to answer your question, this is like a residential unit, but it has a sort of a semi-commercial space. In other words, let me just explain. As you were saying, it's got a 18 by 18 square space in the front that's 15 feet high, and it adjoins the back space, which is residential. Upstairs, you have a bedroom that looks into the space. And when we were thinking about this, we were thinking about we were thinking about architects, we were thinking about engineers, we were thinking about maybe a sculptor, because that, we've, as you can see in our plan, and if you look at the perspective, which is right here, we've got big display windows. And that was for the distinct purpose, if you were a sculptor or you were an architect, you could display some of your work. It was not intended for retail space, not for selling anything other than professional services. So, and that would solve a lot of problems. One, it would be a distinct part of the project. It would also solve the parking problem, and then it would eliminate the prospect of the big question mark. What would it become if it was a retail? Well, I can tell you, if it was retail, it'd be probably a mom and pop organization, and they go in and out. So that would give you a very unstable situation. So we took all those comments from the Planning Commission, and unfortunately I know that some of you weren't here, but there was a very strong consensus to make this, for lack of a better word, a live workspace. And there is a code ordinance, and they describe what it should be, and the components of that. But under no circumstances was it going to be a retail space. And you can certainly put that in your conditions of approval. It's part of the apartment project, and as Mr. McDonald, he wanted it all residential, and we had thought about that, but we sort of wanted to tie in some of the live workspaces that are becoming a part of West Napa, and you can see that already happening. So we kind of wanted to tie that element back in, all the way back to the plaza. And as you can see, there's a lot of those kind of spaces sort of already taking place. So architecturally, I wanted to provide, a space that could be used for a professional or an architect or whatever. But I think you understand what I'm talking about. So that was my presentation. I'd like to turn it over to.
Could I ask you a question on the parking exception while you're still up there?
Absolutely. Well, I've got 11 compacts, and I'm not sure if that's an exception or not.
Well, I did the math, and you were 7% over, but that means if you eliminated 3 of the compact spaces, the 3 uncovered, converted them into 2 regular spaces, you wouldn't need a parking exception, and you still would meet the parking requirement.
Right.
So you could avoid having
my
an
only
exception.
comment there is it's always nice to have extra parking.
Well, but there's also the concern that compact spaces do make it more difficult
Sure,
for
I
larger
understand.
vehicles to park.
What sort of threw a wrinkle into this discussion was that the 2 EV stations cannot be considered parking spaces because they're designated spaces.
I think
Yeah, and we can
you still met the requirements.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, we can absolutely do that. That's not a problem.
Just to piggyback on this discussion, I think a lot of this was driving the number of compact spaces is the carport and the posts for the carport. So something that we could look at is I think we're probably exceeding the number of covered parking spaces. So we might, in commission discussion, look at.
Yeah, I think I've got 3 extra.
Yeah, just looking at things that we can do to get rid of an exception.
All right. If you want to call up.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce.
Just one more question for you.
Back on the live workspace, I really like the live work idea, and I think that these commercial spaces should have some kind of a public service thing. And while I appreciate your presentation about the design of the space and so forth, I think that putting real businesses in there with live work is going to take some effort. You might have to engage brokers, you might have to do some marketing, you might have to spend some extra time negotiating and identifying those tenants. I think it may end up being easier just to let it go and bring some residential people in. That's what I would like to see not happen. And I think you have to be proactive if you're going to bring business in there and have it viable, suitable for your project and viable for the business and the location, all that stuff.
Well,
with that in mind, would you object to being required to have business licenses for those 2 spaces?
Well, quite frankly, I think our approach is the right approach. That we have made available, at least architecturally, the space available for a small type of commercial professional space. We've talked about this before. The strategy of how you lease them up and the type of people that come in and that vacate spaces, it's much more logical to do it the way we've approached it.
Well,
and unfortunately, you weren't here at the original.
Okay.
And so you've missed that whole discussion.
Do you expect those people to be businesses with business licenses then?
I expect them to go down to City Hall and pay the $3 or $4 and get a license and put their shingle up and produce drawings or whatever they like to do. But, one thing I had in mind, my wife is a famous sculptor, and when she saw, we passed this idea, and she just went nuts over it. She said she'd love to have that space herself because she could put her work in front and still have workspace to create her sculptures. But no, we definitely wanted to get away from the retail because we didn't want to get into a situation 1 block away. There's still a sign up right on Highway 12. And it's probably going to be that way for quite some time. We didn't want to get into that situation. That's not good for anybody. And so, to answer your question, we feel very strongly about the approach that we've taken, and we've taken it not and, you know, we've thought about this quite a bit. This was from, I mean, Mr. McDonald can comment on this. He was there, and Mr. Cribb was there. There was a lot of discussion about this, and this was sort of a general consensus that this probably is the best way to go. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
And I'm going to, this is Andrew Clutter, correct? Clutter, sorry. He is our traffic engineer, and he's here to discuss the traffic report.
Good evening, everybody. Andrew Clutter with CHS Consulting Group, traffic and transportation consultant for the project. I'd be happy to entertain questions on the traffic portion. I know there was a issue raised to staff about the driveway issue, so I wanted to just describe that a little bit. The conditions of approval include a feature that basically a physical feature, a K-rail that would force right turns onto northbound Sonoma Highway. The reasoning for that is we did a field review and the site in traffic, what we call site distance, is about a 250-foot site distance for people who are turning right out of the driveway, looking to their left down the bend where Highway 12 transitions from Napa to Sonoma Highway. We felt from that review and based on the counts we collected that was an appropriate measure to prohibit left turns out of the driveway. So I just wanted to close the loop on that particular issue, and I'm available for other questions.
Anybody have a question?
I had 2 questions. One has to do with the site distance for the 4-foot decorative walls. Did you review those to make sure that the triangle visibility is adequate in terms of vehicles entering and exiting? So there doesn't seem to impose any sort of visual
not based on our review. I mean, basically, part of that is, making sure that the, drivers are pulling out, to the driveway edge where they can see the traffic. But based on our review, we did not see a impedance based on that.
Okay. And then the other thing has to do, did you, when you were looking at traffic generation, what was your assumption? Was it all residential, or in terms of the types of movements, or if it was residential, commercial? For example, site visitors, obviously go in and out of a property differently than a resident because they're used to it. Did you evaluate that when you were looking at the traffic counts and generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of the trip generation, we essentially, I think it gets to a point about residential versus live work. The live work, we essentially treat as a residential use. The reason is, compared to a commercial, like say a restaurant use or books or other sort of more intense, I guess, commercial use. In my experience, the live work it sort of generates at a similar rate as a residential. Primarily, it's the person who lives there. Plus, you have, if people are visiting that workspace, they tend to do that outside the peak hours. So in the end, it sort of pencils out in terms of it being similar to a residential use. And so that's how we treated it in the traffic report.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions about the count of traffic. I have concerns about the curve as it relates to the cars going in and out. Wendy, could you put up that this sheet we have up here now doesn't do justice to the curve. It appears to be flat. And if you could put up that figure 1 aerial photo with project site and measurement locations, it has the site plan overlaid on the aerial photo. It's this one. It's in the bottom portion of that last document, I think. You want me to show you a print of this thing?
Oh, it's the very front. I think you. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, do you have a visual there?
Yeah, we have the
Okay.
site plan here.
Here.
which is-
Mm,
Is the one you're referring to?
yeah. Well, let me show you. No, you've got your site plan overlaid on that aerial, that's what I want.
Okay. Yes. Yep.
Check that.
I gotta get you first. Right, no,
Let me not waste any time. So let me make a few comments while we're waiting to get that up on the screen. I think it'll be more clear. Of all the prints, this shows the curvature of Highway 12 as it comes around from Napa, and that's what I want to call some attention to, because I don't seem to have all the answers in the report that I read. It indicates that there is a sight line of 250 feet from the merge point. That's where that curvature, the yield swings around. There's a stop sign for the people coming from the west. When they curve around to the left, they stop. Cars are merging in from the right.
Right. That's the merge point as Highway 12 curves.
Yeah, that's right.
Curves to the right.
I, I didn't find that there was, it says there's 250 feet of clear sight line. I didn't, I've been down there a couple of times driving and walking. I walked there today, walked up and down in front. I don't see that that is a good sight line, because in fact, that curve keeps moving, and as you move towards the driveway, it curves inward. And so there's even more preclusion of the sight line to the traffic that's coming around. As soon as the cars leave Napa and come swinging around to 12, they're accelerating. They're looking at the people parked to the left at the stop sign. People at the stop sign look at them. They're trying to come together there in a pretty touchy situation if you've been up there, and I've been up there hundreds of times.
Right.
So you need to drive another 75 feet past that merge point to where you can begin to see the driveway. And so you can see the driveway. On the other side, if you're in the driveway, you're looking to merge into that traffic again. You've got your K-bar, your K-rail there on the left, keeping you from a left turn. But the way I saw it, walking along the gutter, you get to right to the edge, the southern edge of your property, the beginning of your property, before the cars coming out of the driveway can really react to those cars. And if the light is green, those cars are accelerating. And you quoted 30 miles an hour in your report, but they're going at least 30 miles an hour. They could be going 35 or 40 by the time, if they see the lights clear, they're going to gun it and try to make the light. Meanwhile, there are people sitting there in your driveway trying to make a right turn. And when they pull out, they're going to be forced into that right turn lane, which takes you around to take a ride on Spain Street. There's no other place to go unless you can squeeze out into the main lane of Route 12, where if the light's green, as cars are doing 30 miles an hour or accelerating through there, the guy that doesn't want to go around the block to Spain Street is going to have to try to squeeze into that traffic. Route 12 is a main state highway. It's not a collector and it's not an arterial. And there's a lot of traffic moving through there. A lot of that is through traffic that wants to get out of town and into Boys Hot Springs or Kenwood or Santa Rosa or somewhere. And I think that more study needs to be made of the visibility on both the people coming out and the people coming up, going north into that merge. I think the same thing, driving, it was more difficult for me to come from the north in front of the Napa Auto Parts, which is across the street from your project, where you have to stop and make a left across traffic and get into the site. That, I think, also warrants some more study, because there's a lot of traffic moving through there really fast. These people are going to have to dart in between cars in a busy time. And I don't know whether I think there are safety issues in all the points that I brought up, and I'd like them to be looked at more closely. I think there's a very good chance that there's risk at all those points, because there's so many variables involved that aren't controlled. Now, it's too late now, but everything in that corner has been for sale for the last couple of years. It's too late to get a back entrance on Spain Street, which would have been ideal. There's a big fence there, and there's plenty of room. There's a big driveway through there. It's unfortunate that couldn't be gotten, but now I think there's that issue should be studied much more. I don't think that it can be said that there is what the general plan requires, and that is there's a safety issue that should be covered, and they warned against having sharp curves and dangerous intersections, and I think we've got some element of those things here. And okay, let's look at this drawing a second. The real key is to watch how that curve it's not flat in front of the project, it keeps moving, because that driveway also, the driveway moves inward, which creates more occlusion to the traffic coming up there. Can you flash back to that original piece that shows the site plan that we had on there earlier? The driveway, if you look at, see, there's a compass on here. That driveway is canted northwest. It's not heading straight out. It's canted so that when the car is ready to go, he's that way. You got to look that way to see the cars coming, and I think that makes it even more difficult, since that setback from the street, for that guy to safely pull out. He's not heading straight out. He's looking up the street there. And I think that the way that's situated is going to make it a whole lot more difficult for him to see the traffic, for the traffic to see him. Maybe I'm missing something in the way that's structured, but does that resonate with your idea of the design of that?
So I'm hearing what you're saying about the curve, but I guess I would disagree about the lack of sight distance, because we measured it. Our measurement acknowledges that curve, which is why we measured it from what we call the Gore point. So it's the point where the two traffic streams merge. We're not looking back towards the sort of the rear of the curve down Napa Street. I mean, that can't be seen, but what you can see is the merge point where the two traffic streams come together, and that's where we've been measuring it, and that's where we came in with 250 feet. The traffic is coming around the bend. I would argue it is somewhat of a it's somewhat of a sharp curve, so people aren't coming down at like 50 miles an hour. We're like, it's posted 30. There is some congestion at times, so the prevailing speeds, from what I can tell, are plus the 250 feet suggests that we have enough to see gaps in traffic for one traffic stream. Like, this would be another issue if we were saying the left turns out were allowed as well, because then you have to look for two gaps in traffic. What we're suggesting is close off the left-hand turn out and only having the right turn out.
Are you suggesting that the 250 feet meets the standard that you would be required to have?
Based on Caltrans and AASHTO
Okay, so that
engineering
is,
standards.
that is a
Yes.
standard.
It doesn't, well, it looks like, when you look at this drawing and your overlaid site plan, without being down there, which I've done a couple of times, it even looks physically like you couldn't possibly see that traffic until you're about 100 feet away. And according to the, the general rules of things, you need 70 or 80 feet. You need 70 or 80 feet to stop if you're going 30 miles an hour. Now, I think that's braking time. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert whether that includes realizing that you've got to stop and then stopping. That takes some time. But I know it takes 70 or 80 feet to stop at 30 miles an hour, and you've only got...
Right. Well, that includes, so the 250 includes what you mentioned is the stopping time. The 250 includes what you mentioned, which is the stopping time, but it also includes the perception time. So when a driver is coming around the bend, they first got to perceive where the driveway is and if there's a car coming out. So when you're going down the roadway, that distance is included as well, not just the braking part.
It would be illuminating.
Let me just point out something. The radius where the curve starts is beyond the property line, going to the east. And the other thing you have to take into
Would you repeat that?
which we haven't even talked about, is the trips. I mean, this is a very low density project, and so the trips are very minimal, and you could talk about that.
I'm not so much concerned about the trip side of the project. I am concerned about the busy traffic out front of it. Really. It would be a lot more illuminating to alleviate my concerns if you had had some graphics which show sight lines and distances. There's nothing on there that shows that at all. If you drive down there, you can get very big concerns about everything I brought up. And there's no way to tell from the report that that's all going to be operationally viable and not dangerous and risky. That was my problem when I went up there multiple times. Is there any way that could be formulated in a graphic way to assure me that, or the commission, if there are other concerns here? I don't know about that. It seems inadequate to me to describe, to support the findings that it is a safe ingress and egress there. It looks the opposite to me, based on what I read here, and what I've seen when I walked there.
I think your point's been made. Let's Commissioner Burnett.
When you said 250 feet, the graphic that's on the screen now, what are you using as what point is 250 feet away that you're using?
So if you follow the curve from westbound Napa to the point where it meets northbound Sonoma Highway.
Mm-hmm. So right
if you're familiar with that, it's what we call a free right turn. So basically, it's sort of a ramp, and where it meets, so that's a visible line from the driveway, and that's where we're measuring So we're not measuring it down the curve because you can't see that from the driveway. We're measuring it from that gore point.
So sort of where Wendy has her cursor there, right there. That's
right.
So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Bohar, but I think what he is saying is the driveway is sort of in. I mean, it goes.
Mm-hmm.
It's further to the east than the curb, all the way up, and with that 4-foot wall, on one side.
3.6.
Thank you. Are you saying you're going to from that point where the cursor is, you can see the driveway?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we've worked that one as far as we're going to work it. Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else from the public care to speak on this item?
It's still the presentation of the developer, isn't it?
We've had that presentation.
Okay.
That's what we've been doing for the last 45 minutes or so. And we are now still in public comment, but there's nobody else rising to speak, so I'm going to close public comment and bring it back to the commission for discussion and possible action.
I guess can I go first?
Yep.
Okay, so I wanted to thank the applicant, their perseverance and their patience, because this has been taking a long time to get to this point with the heavy agenda of the Planning Commission and delays with environmental review. But I wanted to thank you again for taking a look at the project and making the changes since our study session that I was a part of as well. And my overall feeling is I want to support this project. I want to support an infill development proposal. I want to support a housing project that provides affordable housing units that we desperately need. But I also feel I want to make sure that this is as well designed as possible, that it meets and exceeds expectations of the community. And I have also some concerns and reservations about the application of a live-work situation. I think many of these things can be easily, at least in some of my concerns, can easily be resolved either through conditions of approval, through changes to the site plan, or recommendations to the Architectural Review Commission. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is some of my concerns about the live-work issues, because that has to do with the use permit application and also the operations. And it's refreshing to hear the applicant talk about that their real overall intent was to provide a place for residents in those two units to provide some sort of professional service or use. My concern has always been, and particularly because of its unique location on the highway, that any sort of business that would have any sort of food or beverage or any sort of retail component really made me feel very uncomfortable. And we have the opportunity as part of a use permit to put any sort of restriction or condition. My recommendation would be to prohibit any sort of food or beverage service and any sort of retail service, and limit it to professional services. I would like some discussion with the commission as to whether or not we would allow some sort of office use, because that is something that I kind of on the fence about. The other aspect of the live-work issue has to do with whether or not we actually put a condition saying that the person has to occupy and live in the space and also be a permanent resident. I'd like the commission to talk about this a little bit more, because there's no real specific language as part of the use permit. And what I would not want to see is somebody actually renting the space out and not living there, and turning the upstairs into an office and downstairs into some sort of professional service like an architecture's office. And then it begs the whole point of having the live use component. So I want to talk about possibly some language that would require a person that's renting the space to live there. So the other aspect has to do with parking. And maybe I should have been more thorough, because the last time I looked at the conditions was back in August, but I wanted to make sure that the parking for the residents was restricted and signed specifically for the residents, because if we do have a work component, I want to make sure that there's a designated area for guest parking, not only for the residents guests, but also for guests that are going to be using those live workspaces. So I want to make sure that we got some crafted language that definitely provides a designated parking painted on the surface and also or signage. So now comes my little part about design and parking more abstractly. I have a concern and reservation about the long, I'll call it train car of covered parking spaces, the carport. If you take a look at the elevation and you take a, well, we have a picture of what it would look like, but if you take a look at the site plan, it basically encompasses the whole south side of the parking. So it's basically from all the Unit Bs all the way down to Unit C. And I don't know, I think we exceed covered parking, and we also have the ability, if we have the ability to provide a parking exception for compact spaces, I don't see why we couldn't reduce the bulk of that covered parking and make an exception to reduce that carport and that visual aspect and reduce the requirement for covered parking. I think that also would reduce or eliminate the need for a parking exception for compacts, because I think what's driving this really is the whole aspect of the support columns for the carports, and creates a restricted parking space and therefore would be considered a compact space. So I'd like to talk with the Commission about possibly reducing the bulk and visibility of that carport and reducing its size to open the light and air up into the Units A and also Unit C, and also you know, just it visually competes with the whole aspect of trying to create a more livable community. Right now it's very parking and auto-centric, and I think by eliminating the carports you might be able to soften that up to some extent. Also, we do have 30 spaces and the code requires 28, and I have concerns about the actual amount of landscaping that's being proposed at the driveway on both sides. I know we were talking a little bit about screening the parking, but if you take a look at the engineering and the engineering drawings, you'll note that 100% of the front yard landscaping is devoted to BMT area, which is basically for drainage, a ditch, a swale, whatever. Problematic planting trees, planting any sort of vegetation, and there are plants that grow there and trees, but very limited. I would like to see us, if we were to do anything, is to reduce the number of parking spaces on site, eliminating maybe the first 2 front parking spaces to increase the amount of landscaping in front to create a better buffer and to actually create spaces where you can actually grow something and create a landscape buffer. So I'd like the Commission to take that idea that I'm throwing out to see if we can maybe further make improvements to landscaping and landscape buffers and improve the frontage. So those are my comments, is to look at reducing the carport, making it smaller, making it less auto-centric, increasing the amount of landscaping in the front outside of the BMT area that we can actually plant stuff. Look at restrictions in terms of parking, making sure that they're designated and signed, and then also looking at restrictions for the actual uses that would go in those live workspaces. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I wholeheartedly agree with Commissioner McDonald's recommendations. Especially when it comes to potentially removing a couple parking spaces to create more landscaping. I think I would certainly defer to him on landscaping and what you can and cannot plant there, but I do believe in addition to the walls, landscaping will be very important to soften that large parking area. And so anything that can help that, I definitely support. When it comes to live work, I think if we're going to have 2 live work units, we should have 2 live work units. And so I think that and I do like the concept, but I think that businesses need to be in there. In it, you know, and not only do people need to live there, but they also need to have businesses there. And so I would want to put that as a condition of approval. When it comes to, I'm open to hearing what the rest of the commission has to say about reducing the carport, as Commissioner McDonald suggested. I also wanted, Wendy, can you check your, I just sent you a graphic, because we talked a lot about this visibility in the traffic study Commissioner Bohar did, and anyway, you can go on Google Maps and look exactly how it looks, and I thought that might assuage, or not assuage, but help your concerns. Because if that's going to be part of your discussion and our discussion in terms of the safety here, I sent what it looks like. And so maybe that'll come up at some point during commissioner comment. But okay. And, you know, obviously they can discuss that. I mean, there's some foliage there that I think is going to be removed, but it might assuage some of your concerns, or it might not. But I thought it'd be good, since we were focusing on that, that we should actually look what it looks like from the 250 feet away. But in general, I support the improvements to this parcel. I think that, yeah, there it is. So if you see the blue down there, that's where that's basically the 250 foot point. Maybe you can zoom in a little. It's sort of hard to see. I took it from my phone. But
look at me zooming in.
So I assume all that foliage up there at the top is going to be gone.
Where's that location, the S in Sonoma?
Well, if you go zoom a little further back, Wendy, where that blue is, a little further back, sorry. Okay, so see where the blue meets?
Oh, I see, sure.
That's the 250 foot. And so from there, anyway, that's what we've been talking about. But in general, I support the concept. I think this is a good location for apartments. I believe that, I mean, it is a commercial zone, and so that's why I do like the incorporation of the live work. And I'm open to hearing what the rest of the commission has to say.
Okay. I'll, well, like has been stated so far, I'm very favorable towards this project. Seen it from the beginning. I would concur with Commissioner McDonald's eliminating parking in favor of planting. I have made comments before that parking should not be plentiful and free anymore, and so anything we can do to reduce parking and create more green space, I think, would be good. I don't necessarily agree on the swale issue, because I think, if, for example, if you just looked at the Vallejo home in the estate, you see natural swales that occur there, and there are numerous native species, flowers, grasses, and things that live in a sort of a constant year-round state. You know, that I think it's important that we have those swales. The more swales we can have, the more groundwater recharge we'll have, and also the more native species we can have, the better it is. So I would be in favor of retaining that, and suggesting that it maybe be planted with native species. I think you have a pretty decent landscape architect that you're working with. And I can take that up with him offline if you want. So I don't have an issue there. Just a quick question of staff on the Commissioner McDonald mentioned the idea that someone might like take one of those, put an office in the 18 by 18 space and another office, and but that's actually prohibited, right, in the code. So we don't actually have to. You sort of can't take
Right.
a living space and convert it into a pure commercial space,
No, you
right?
can't.
That you can't. Yeah. So I don't think that needs to be conditioned. I'm fine on the other end about it not. I think just as the applicant said, I think it naturally would occur that that's going to be a space like an artist or a architect or maybe a CPA or somebody might use, where someone, an attorney who has minimal need to meet with their clients, but needs to have a meeting space or an office space that they can use. So I would want to be careful about how restrictive we got, just so that we're not sort of micro-engineering this. Breaking up the carport sounds like a good idea to me. Anytime you can sort of break any kind of massive space into smaller pieces, it just makes it more palatable. So I would support that. But I mean, in general, I very much like the plan and hope to see it go forward.
Do you have further comments?
I think I can agree with all of the comments from the last three commission speaks. I guess also Chairman Felder mentioned the undesirability of increasing the number of compact spaces, and I don't like that idea myself. I think that compact spaces in general in a mixed environment like this invite a lot of angst and bang doors, and this project may attract more than the average number of pickup trucks, which is going to add to that problem. So I would be against adding more, a parking exception to add more compact spaces. I think the parking looks adequate to me. Just ask a question of the rest of the commissioners. Am I the only one that has this level of concern about the safety of the egress, ingress? Is that
I don't. I mean, I can see, and from what the consultant did, it's right. And I know from my site visits there, I never had an issue pulling out. I was always able to, even in the current conditions with that bush that was there, I was able to come out of the existing driveway that's there, and always felt like I had plenty of time to, I mean, I may have had to wait sometimes for a few cars to go by, but I never felt like I was just having to dart into oncoming traffic without adequate space. So it seemed to me that, because it was one of my big concerns when I first thought about the project, but as I visited and walked it and stood and paced it off, it seemed like there was the adequate space. So I have no issue whatsoever with that part.
Thanks. Any other? So my concerns are really they're on a higher level than everybody else. I gather. Is that safe to say?
I think they're good concern. I mean, obviously, we need to consider the safety. I just thought maybe bringing up that picture might assuage some of those concerns.
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
And I mean, yeah, I have concerns as well, but the traffic report signed off, and in my experience over there as well, it seemed to be okay. But yeah.
I'm generally would support this project. I think it's a good project in total. I certainly agree with a lot of the comments of the other commissioners, especially Commissioner McDonald. I would certainly welcome some of those things being added as conditions of approval. I'm going to back off of this idea of eliminating some compact spots and converting them into regular spots. I like the other idea better, to eliminate a couple of parking spots up front and get more landscaping in. So I think you could eliminate 2 spots and still meet the parking requirement, which kind of satisfies that. So in general, I'm supportive of the project, and I think it's a good project. So I would look for somebody to try to craft a motion and perhaps add some conditions.
Before we do that, I think we're in general agreement that we want to reduce the the size of the carport. Could staff confirm what is the requirements for covered parking for this particular project based on the unit size, I mean, the unit count?
1 space per unit is required to be covered in the
Okay.
development code.
And so all we really have to do is have 12 covered parking spaces, is that correct?
14.
14? And how many are proposed covered?
18.
18.
Okay, so so good. Okay, so I guess our recommendation would be to eliminate then 4 covered parking spaces, reducing the carport by 4. Could the commission agree that that's okay?
Sure.
Or do you want to even, because it's not noticed to an exception to the code for reducing the number of covered spaces. We're only noticed for compact, is that correct?
It was noticed as a parking exception.
Oh, okay, so we could theoretically, I'd like to see maybe even more covered parking spaces eliminated then, too. I'd like to see the carport seems to make a natural transition where the unit A units end, and so it seems to me I'd like to see the carport end around there. So that means we would eliminate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 covered parking spaces, not 4. That would line, the carport then would line up with all the Unit As. I think the Design Review Commission can look at the actual aesthetics of the carport itself.
I would, I'd be opposed to that because I think it's fair to give every unit a covered parking space with our summers here, that not to have a place where they don't have to go out into a car that's been baking in the sun. And I mean, it might extend a little bit, but I just wouldn't want to, basically, I would think in a sense that would devalue one unit by, and I'd rather see we stay to eliminating it to,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
keeping it at
I could
14.
see cutting it back to the required number, but
Right,
then
yeah.
I'd stop there.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fair.
Well,
That makes
why-
sense.
Why not just go back to A and then bring the other one out a little further? Isn't there another structure on the north side?
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah. I mean,
Bring that one down.
right. Oh, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, that would achieve, like, you know, like what I'm trying to do is just trying to eliminate the number of carports that are visible from the
Right.
highway as much as possible, because they're kind of unsightly. So, just fleshing this out, we would still reduce the number of covered parking spaces by 4. I mean, it wouldn't need an exception, and we would just flip one of the covered parking spaces to the other side. We can agree upon that. Okay, so then the second part has to do with my concern about putting restriction on only professional services. Could we all agree that we would just limit it, the commercial activity to professional services or put some sort of language prohibiting retail, food and beverage services? How would we want to do? We could either do either way. My concern is no retail sales, food or beverage. Anything else, I really think.
So what if you had like an art gallery and you were selling your art?
It's a good question. Or a sculptor, so.
Because that's retail, but it's not
it's-
food and beverage.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, or a textile maker, or I mean, I could see a lot of maker
Or
kinds
a
of people.
or a
but-
cannabis dispensary.
How about
Yeah.
this? Because basically, I had to go back to my brain cells as a city planner. Is there a way that we can allow retail sales but limit the floor plate to a certain area? They say you can have retail sales, but it can be no more than 50% area or something like that. So, or do we just not care about retail? just because it's 1,800 square feet and that's not big enough.
It's
Well,
18 by 18, so that's...
to the staff's point, if there were a restaurant use or a coffee shop or whatever, that would require an additional use permit, so that's automatically not covered under the current conditions.
Okay.
So maybe we don't get more restrictive.
Maybe we don't, okay, maybe we don't.
Yeah, you're
add
talking
any.
324 square feet.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's not much people can do with that.
So maybe we don't put any language. So,
Well, certain uses would require a permit anyway. Yeah, I mean, you know, a restaurant or certain, they'd require a permit anyway. I mean, the sort of things that wouldn't require a permit.
So somebody would want to do a coffee shop or a restaurant, they would have to come into the planning department and you would say you need a use permit, and they would come to us and we'd say you can't because there's not enough parking and it's too dangerous.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so then the last thing that I brought up has to do with marking the actual parking spaces, guests and residents. I think that's a real easy condition. So, so I would like to make a motion then to approve the mitigated negative declaration, right? Because that's the first action we have to take. The environmental review and the.
Let's make those as separate.
Oh, okay. So, do you want to do that one first?
Is that more appropriate to make them as separate motions?
Yeah.
Sure.
All right, I would prefer that.
Great.
So I'd like to make a motion that we approve the mitigated negative declaration. What's the address?
19410.
For 1940 Highway 12.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 The motion carries 5-0.
Okay, and so for the use permit and site plan and architectural review, I'd like to make to approve the project with the following modifications, changes, or conditions. The first is to eliminate 4 of the covered parking spaces the site plan provides along Building 1, Units C, and to take one of the covered parking spaces in front of the Unit A and move it from the south side of the site plan to the north. The project would also be modified to eliminate the 2 front parking spaces, to go from 30 parking spaces to 28. And the 2 front parking spaces would then be incorporated into the landscaping, and the Site Plan and Architectural Review Commission would review the landscaping and the placement of the gate, the fence screening. Then lastly, a modification, an addition of condition of approval to require that the guest parking and the resident parking be appropriately signed and marked.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any discussion?
Yeah. So was there any, is there, I guess, are you open to a friendly amendment to require the live-work units be, operated as a business, like true live-work units?
Yeah, I wasn't hearing anybody saying yay or nay on that, but from what I'm understanding, that's a requirement anyway, that you have to live there.
You have to live there.
You have
No,
to
but
live.
there needs to be a business as well.
But there needs to be a business.
Or that's what
Is-
I
is
was
that-
talking about.
But I don't know if you necessarily have to have a business. You can just live there.
Right. Unless a business license is a requirement.
Right. I'm saying we should require it to be live-work, like with a business.
Oh, well.
With a business license?
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
That comes with it.
because I think they're just going to end up probably just being apartments.
Right.
And so I would like to try to get some sort of commercial.
Okay.
Or that's just my, I mean, if the commission doesn't want that, that's fine, but that's what I was thinking would be a good idea.
Well, I would certainly support that myself, what Commissioner Barnett just outlined.
I'd like to add that friendly amendment and see what my other commissioners have to say.
I'll support it.
Okay.
Okay. Any further discussion? Let's take a vote on this motion as amended. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Motion passes 5-0.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
We're really
You've been
looking
very
forward to
patient.
the
Thank you
project.
for your patience. We'll give Commissioner Wallander a chance to return if he is still out there. Did he go home?
Yes, he's still there.
Guess he's lost interest in the project.
So we'll move on the agenda. There are no items listed for discussion, so we are at issues update.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. The last meeting, a number of issues were raised and concerns about the staffing level and planning at the city. As a result of that, the city manager asked me if I would give you an update on the recruitment activities and also on what we're doing to handle the projects that are in the pipeline right now. Just by way of background, I know I'm telling you things you know already, but you've lost some very key people in the last 3 months. There was a planning director who's been in the city for 30 years, and someone who's been in planning for 17 years, and that's 33, that's 50 years of experience out the door in about 2 or 3 months. A lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of talent, a lot of experience. As a result, you've got something to avoid. And since that time, I can say that the city staff's been working diligently to try to replace those folks. They've been out recruiting. They have a recruitment that's in the final stages, knock on wood. Hopefully things will come of that for the planning director position. But you have to understand something right now in this environment. It's very tight. It's difficult. There are a number of restrictions out there. Public employees retirement system limits what people like I can do as a retired employee in providing assistance to cities. You have consulting firms that pay more than cities do for folks with planning talent. With all developments out there, it's gotten to be a real problem. The cost of living, of course, in the Bay Area, and Sonoma included, causes some difficulty in attracting folks. And a lot of very seasoned folks with the baby boom generation are moving on and retiring and leaving. And so it's a tough market right now. But I think the city manager is very hopeful that she'll find someone who will be a good fit for this community. And that's the key, too. I mean, she's not interested in just bringing someone in to fill the position. She wants to make sure it's someone that works for this community in planning. So while they are in the final stages of that and working on the senior planner position as well, that's going to be a major concern for her. In addition to that, we've been working on looking for planning consulting firms that can come in and help with projects in a couple of different ways. One, just to replace staff, help maybe at the counter, for example, or help with specific projects. And also planners who can come in when a developer will come and pay the cost of their work to get things moving. Because things right now, given the staffing levels and given the activity you've got going here, it could take a while to get projects through the pipeline. So what is pretty common in a lot of cities is the developer will come in, pay for the cost of a planner to oversee and manage a given project and take it to the system. And we are looking at that very closely and have some good proposals for that as well. So things are moving. It's I'm sorry we couldn't go into a lot of detail last time. I guess it was last week, wasn't it? Was it just last week? Yeah. But a lot was happening then, actually, and I really couldn't share too much, certainly without talking to the city manager first. She does assure that she'll be providing periodic updates and let folks know. I think she sent some emails out in the past to let you know the status of different recruitments and what's going on with the planning staff. So that's generally where things stand. If you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them if I can.
Sure. Has there been any thought given to like raising the salary, to compete with these consulting firms? I mean, is that the issue?
Well, I think that's always something of interest. I can't say for certain that's been seriously considered at this point, but yeah, I think that's certainly a reasonable idea.
And then that last thing you mentioned, I would like to learn more, I guess, about those proposals. I would just personally advise caution on that, because I think if it looks like a developer is paying for the staff's work on a certain project, that could look a little tainted.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a very good point, Commissioner. The way those systems work, or the way that process works, is the city will contract directly with the consultant. The developer pays the city. So the consultant works directly for the city under the circumstances. There's no, it's not a matter of the developer coming in and giving us a proposal prepared by a project planner of some kind. We hire the planner.
Okay.
But there's still the danger of perception.
There is absolutely, certainly.
I guess just to follow up on that, I know the council was looking at augmentations to the fee schedule, and also this fee schedule would allow for the planning department to charge for code enforcement on an hourly basis and all that stuff. So what's the status of that, and how does what the council is doing to change the fee structure allow for us to have better planning?
Well, that is an idea that's in process, you're right. What a lot of cities do is a fee analysis, as I'm sure you're aware, where they look at the actual cost of doing a particular application, like a general plan amendment or zoning change, and they will require a deposit or raise their fees to cover that actual cost. That hasn't been done here in quite some time. And I know that that is being studied and that there is a real interest in making that change. And also, by the way, as a part of these planning contracts, just because the developer's paying for the cost of the planner, what a lot of cities do will charge an administrative fee, because there's a lot of oversight required of planning staff and of the accounting department and other departments in the city. And so you want to make sure you get compensation for all that work.
Right. I am very familiar with how
Yeah.
those systems work.
Exactly.
Is that the path the city is sort of considering going long term, or is this just sort of a bridge situation?
Well,
because I think there was a real benefit and value to having planners that were here for a long time and really got the city. Planning is so much more than just applying the code. There's a lot more to it, obviously, and when we just have these contract planners coming from various places, they might not appreciate certain things about Sonoma that our long-term staffers do.
I understand entirely, and I can't speak much to that, but what I can say is my impression that that's not the intent. It's a stopgap measure, that there's every intention to recruit to fill the positions that are vacant right now and make sure you staff up to handle the workload you've got.
I'll just add one more comment on that about the consultants. Particularly in the area of cultural and historical issues that are woven in these big projects, only the community can make those kinds of decisions really, ultimately. The Planning Commission, the City Council, you can't delegate that kind of thing out very much, those nuances.
Mm-hmm.
Is that you finished then?
Yes, that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reese.
Is there a status update of the projects that are in the pipeline, though?
I don't think you had anything prepared, did you?
I'm not prepared for that tonight, Commissioner, but we'll get something to you soon.
All right, thank you.
You bet.
All right, we have comments from the commission. Anyone have any further comments?
Yeah, I was reading the paper this morning and it came across what I think is a very germane topic that is current, and I am passing a copy of this article about across the U.S. 5G runs into local resistance having to do with the cell towers. So I'm not advocating that you start reading the Wall Street Journal, nor am I advocating which side of the fence. I'm just saying this is information.
As Commissioner Welander hands that out, I did want to bring up it was a question or a comment related to cell tower applications and the city's involvement in leasing and creating long-term leases on public property. One of my big concerns about several of the applications, especially the ones that are in the downtown and the historic district, as it relates to aesthetics and our potentially our inability to, in the long term, underground utilities, underground telephone poles, underground unsightly wires in our downtown core and our historic district. I know that there's several applications, or at least one, that would encumber and basically put in to effect a long-term lease of city property and on a pole. And I know that we're going to be updating our general plan, we're going to updating our zoning code, we're going to be looking at community design standards for the architectural and also public improvement aspects of our historic core. And I guess my question or comment is, by the city allowing these use permits or these cell towers, it encumbers the city in the long term to actually make those civic improvements, street tree improvements, undergrounding utility improvements, and street light pole improvements to our historic core. And I want to understand what these leases are and if they're revocable, and when the city, for example, if we were to approve something, is it revocable upon us making improvements to the public right-of-way? These are all questions that I would have as a commissioner and also as a citizen, particularly the ones that are in the downtown and the historic district. So maybe when these applications come forward, that's going to be something that's very paramount, and in my mind, at least for the ones that are in the historic district.
I do know that part of the reason that the Verizon thing was delayed was the questions that the city asked for information on concerning aesthetics and undergrounding, and Verizon had to go back and study that.
Ah, see, I didn't know that. Okay.
To follow up on that, what is the status of those applications? I feel like a meeting has been scheduled at various times and it always keeps getting pushed back.
Can we get back to you on that, Commissioner?
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes. Is the city aware of, because I'm just reading this article that Commissioner Welander provided, and it says that, for example, the FCC says these are exempt from historic preservation and environmental reviews, and Congress may pass something that these applications are granted if we fail to act within 31 days or something. You know.
There's a lot of things in place like that, and some of that has been forestalled with agreements with Verizon. where they gave up their rights to push it within that time period, but it's,
Why would they do that?
well, they're trying to get it in, so they're trying to negotiate. That's my
Well, it just
personal
sounds like
opinion.
they have a lot of.
Any further comments from the commission? Otherwise, I'm going to entertain a motion for adjournment.
I'll move we adjourn.
He wants to speak.
All in favor?
Aye.
I'm sorry, there's no comments from the public at the end of the meeting. Sorry.
I think there's a lot of